All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like, imixwhatilike.org, at I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, happy to be your host. And we're joined today for a conversation about the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report, this being the 50th anniversary of the mainstream press publication coverage of the report. We're joined to discuss that report with Dr. Keisha Bentley-Edwards, who is an assistant professor at Duke University's School of Medicine and the associate director of research for the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. She is a developmental psychologist who takes an interdisciplinary approach to studying cultural strengths, racism, the intersection of race and gender for their impact on social health and educational outcomes. Dr. Bentley-Edwards, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I know you've done some work on the Kerner Commission report. It is most famously known for the infamous or famous phrase that in 1968, upon its publication, that we have reached a society that is, or we are about to reach a society that is separate, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And in many ways, it shocked Lyndon Johnson, who had called for its initial calling into being after the so-called riots in 1967. And then he was stunned to the point where he didn't even want anything to do with the report and didn't even want it to be delivered to the White House.
Well, he fired everyone on there multiple times.
Even after having threatened them with the removal of their penises if they didn't follow what he wanted done, they still disappointed him. But yes, please tell us about the Kerner report and then specifically what your research has found.
Well, thinking about the Kerner report, you have to also think about what happened the year prior, 1967. And last year there was a movie about the riots in Detroit, but there were riots in about 100 different cities throughout the United States. And so for a lot of people from the outside looking in, it's what's going on with the Negroes. We just passed the Civil Rights Act. We're working on Civil Rights Acts 1 and 2, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, and now they're rioting? What is happening? And so, we gave them what they want, is what a lot of people perceived. So this commission was formed, this National Commission on Civil Unrest, and now we call it the Kerner Commission report. And that's really how this came about. Like, what's going on? Why is there so much Black rage? And what can we do to stop it? Because we can't have another summer with 100 cities rioting. And that's really the basis of it.
I should have covered this in the initial intro. It was initially called the Report of the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, and headed up by then Governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, hence the name Kerner Commission, often just referred to as the Kerner Report. And often mostly discussed in terms of its chapter on media, though it's a 300-page book. That really talks about many of the society's problems, specifically entrenched racism and economic inequality, and they even talk about apartheid level segregation that led to the uprisings. But you also have a particular take as a psychologist, but also you looked at what it did not do, and
exactly
how far it did not go.
Yeah. Exactly. So, yes, it does acknowledge, and it was big at that time for a government report, and not just a government report, a presidential commission to actually say that white racism and white supremacy is the root cause for these uprisings. However, there were a lot of things that were missing. So it was like, let's go ahead and cite all these issues of inequality that is going on and this oppression that's going on. But, the Black folks are also very responsible for that. And especially Black women. So Black women aren't really discussed very much at all in this 300 and some odd page book, except for when they go and borrow from the Moynihan report and start talking about social disorganization, how the fact that there are so many more Black female-held female-headed households, or at that time they would say non-white female-headed households, and that's the cause for so much family social disorganization, as well as what they would call the lack of solid citizens in the ghetto. And so those things all have to be considered, like, well, where were the Black women? And it's especially because there were Black women who are participants, and also Black women were often the root of the anger. When I say the root of the anger, is that police abusing a Black woman oftentimes was what caused folks to get so angry that the riotings erupted. So it was oftentimes a triggering incident for these Black riots, but Black women are remarkably missing. And even when you talk about Black women being raped, all these things were part of the story, but were missing. So that's one key aspect that's missing. The other aspect, if you're talking about race-based civil unrest, there's very little conversation about white riots. And you have to consider that up until 1963, when you talked about white riots, when you're talking about race riots, you were talking about white people terrorizing Black people in their communities. So it's very odd that the memory becomes very shortened. And even incidents that happen a year or so or within 5 years of the race riots in 1967. So the bombings of the Freedom Riders, right? And all those terrorist acts that were occurring, they're not even really discussed at length. They do mention the 50 or so bombings that occurred in Birmingham that occurred over a 15-year time period. But it's all just like, oh yeah, there were some bombings, there were some individual white racists, so it was this bad apple approach that we see that people talk about now when we talk about police brutality, but it was always talked about as white racist individuals, but not something that was really part of the fabric of the community. And these white riots were insane. You hear often talk if you are on any type of social media, every 2 days someone will talk about, oh, remember Black Wall Street in Tulsa from the race riots that occurred in 1921, or back in the 90s, the movie Rosewood, talking about that whole town that does not exist anymore. But there were literally hundreds of these incidents, and these are just mass mob race riots. We're not talking about lynchings that were also part of it. We're not talking about terrorism that were bombings that occurred. We're just talking about a mob coming in and tearing up everything that was Black owned. So those happened, and that was not included in the conversation when you talked about civil unrest and race and how some of the folks that were in these cities their families had already been displaced because of these race riots that occurred in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. So when you start having this police brutality, the unfair lending practices or predatory lending practices, whether it was in Chicago when it came to homes, was it in any type of community when it came to just getting your furniture, all these types of predatory lending and banking practices that were going on. These race riots that Black folks were engaging in, they weren't random. They were going back. When they were looked at as looting, oftentimes they were reclaiming their property that had been repossessed because of these predatory lenders. So there are things that aren't really being considered when you talk about Black race riots in this period, that some of it even wasn't included in this discussion, but especially the white race riots, the white terror campaigns that are really the basis and the foundation when you talk about police brutality and police complicity and government complicity in the oppression and obliteration of Black communities.
Yeah, that's interesting because the closest, as I am aware, that the report comes to discussing any of that is their focus on police violence. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting to hear your take because certainly some of the literature about the Kerner Commission argues that it was a more materialist. That's not the right word. But a more I don't know what's the I guess material, but that's not really the word I'm looking for. But it was based more in the socioeconomic structural conditions imposed on Black people than the Moynihan's report's focus culturally on the role of Black women in the household in terms of what is causing inequality. So it was seen in some circles as a more progressive or advanced, at least for the government, take on this. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, in a lot of ways it was. And for that time period. And so we do have to acknowledge that we're looking at this report from a 50-year lens. So, we have the 2020 vision.
No. Well, but at the same time, I'm sorry to cut you off, but just to clarify, but at the same time, even people then were saying this isn't enough.
No, absolutely.
Like for Johnson, this might have been an advance or something scary, but certainly for the real left, for even Dr. King and others, certainly Malcolm X aired politically. That is,
absolutely.
This was not.
And the thing, there were some things that even when it came to the critique of American society and racism. So you think about Gunnar Myrtle's American Dilemma. It talks about. This wasn't written in the 1940s. This wasn't pulled out to say, well, what does this look like? When he talked about the lynchings and the riots that are happening in the North and South, that wasn't included. So there was already very concrete work that was going on by some established white scholars, European scholars like Gunnar Myrtle, but also there were Black scholars that were already talking about these issues. So it's not as if, but a lot of those people were not in the room. So there were Black people in the room, but they were politicians. They weren't necessarily the scholars. So
So in terms, but as a liberal mainstream critique of the liberal mainstream, the Kerner Commission, that is the white liberal mainstream, the Kerner Commission report is relatively speaking a progressive document. But from the perspective of anyone involved in any honest assessment or activist struggle against those conditions, it seems pretty tame. As was the critique of King and many others. But so as we do look at it 50 years out, in my own little investigation of the subject, just trying to make a comparison and looking at what happened just a few years ago in Baltimore, where not only do you have another uprising, but you have the press behaving almost the exact same way, not only preceding the event of not properly making people aware of what was going on and the context, but then as the event happens, not only spreading false information, but misreporting the levels of violence and the levels of the So I guess I just, as a sort of a concluding segue comment or invitation for a comment from you, where do you see things as they are now? Where do you see us? I think where does your work take us going forward?
Well, I think that there are parallels. Even when people talked about what was going on in Baltimore a few years ago, or in Missouri, in Ferguson, when they were making comparisons, they would make comparisons to the Civil Rights Act. Like, people in the Civil Rights Act, when the Civil Rights was going on, people were tame, people were peaceful. It's like, well, the civil rights protesters were peaceful, but the response was not. Like, that's something that which is where you have a lot of similarities, is that you had peaceful protests where the cops were antagonizing the protesters here in this contemporary time. One of the differences is that they didn't have the training that was occurring at Fisk University and some of the other historically Black colleges, where it's like, this is how you respond to police intimidation and police antagonizing you. So that's one really key difference in the way that people respond to this. Like, it's not a natural inclination for someone to be screaming at you, calling you names, pushing and shoving on you, for you not to respond in some type of defensive way. So you know, you have to think about that there was training involved. But the other thing is that people think that the civil rights movement was only about integration and voting rights. Or even they think it was about affirmative action, which wasn't really part of the civil rights movement. You have to understand a big part of it was police brutality, and that part of the conversation is missing because the police brutality is not a new topic, and it's endured and it's never let up. And so if I were to compare then to now, we're in a lot of the same places. The difference is that now we have video recordings so that hopefully, you know, in the future, people will be like, wait a minute, there were recordings of this and the police still got off? I mean, the police got off then, the police get off now. So in a lot of ways, there aren't a lot of differences, except that now we have people who can talk about it and having other conversations that are more well spread out because we do have these other communication devices.
And let's hope that we can build from that with some sufficient levels of organization, because that is, I think, to the point as I heard it that you were making, is one of the things that is lacking.
Yes, yeah, but it's coming though. So if you look at groups like the Dream Defenders, like they really are, you know, an organized group. You know, they may be throwing rocks, but they are throwing rocks every day, you know, at the system and at the man. You know, they're organizing in different cities. And so it's happening. And there is this rising of young, Black, brilliant activist scholars that are being raised, but we got to give them time to mature and learn.
Yes, indeed. Well, Dr. Bentley-Edwards, thank you very much for joining us for this quick look at the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report. And as Fred Hampton used to say, to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it, as we know you are. And to our audience, we say the same, peace if you're willing to fight for it. Thanks again for joining us here at I Mix What I Like.
All right. Have a great day. Be well.
I mix what I like.